In our last conversation, Thomas Jefferson and I talked about what shaped him. The vineyards of Burgundy, the science of botany, the scuppernong in his cellar, and the European vines that kept dying on the mountain at Monticello. 7 experiments, 50 years, not one bottle from his own grapes. But, as Jefferson put it, the dream was not wrong, the vine was wrong. Today we go deeper. The native vine he almost embraced, the misattributed quote that has followed him for 2 centuries, the political argument for wine that still holds up, and the most heartbreaking story in American wine history, a wooden box of grape cuttings that arrived 2 years too late. I'm Sam Zamarripa. This is Uncorked. Let's continue. There came a point after the European vines kept dying when you started turning toward what was already here, the Native American vines. What drove that turn?
Honesty, eventually. I watched the native vines. They asked nothing extraordinary of our soil or our climate. They did not require rescue. They simply belonged. And belonging, I came to understand, is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most important thing a plant can do. I began to believe that the Native American vine was not a lesser thing than the European vine. It was a different thing, and different on this continent, in this soil, under this particular sky. Different might prove to be better. That belief, I now understand, was not merely a personal preference. It was the recognition of a sovereign category. The Native American varietal does not need to imitate Bordeaux to be valuable. It has its own legitimacy, its own character, its own claim on greatness. It took me 50 years and considerable money to arrive at a conclusion that the land had already reached without my help.
Different might prove to be better. 6 words that changed American wine. And what you just named, the native varietal as a sovereign category, that is the philosophical foundation of everything we do at Doghobble. We are not making an American version of a French wine. We are making something that has no European equivalent because it comes from ground that Europe never touched. That argument starts with you.
Though I will confess, conviction arrived somewhat behind the evidence. I am not entirely proud of how long it took.
You were corresponding with people working on native vines. John Adlam experimenting with Catawba. You were building a network, every botanist, every grower, every serious mind, thinking about what American soil could actually produce.
Adlam was remarkable, passionate, persistent. He believed in the Catawba with a fervor I recognized immediately, because I had felt the same fervor about rather more vines than had justified it. He once said, and I have always admired the audacity of it, that in bringing his grape to public notice, he had rendered his country a greater service than if he had enabled it to pay back the national debt.
Mr. Jefferson, I have to tell you something about that quote.
Oh?
For 200 years, that line has been attributed to you, carved on signs, printed on wine labels, repeated at dinner parties by people who think they're quoting the 3rd president of the United States. It was Adlam. It has always been Adlam. You didn't say it.
I am simultaneously relieved and somewhat deflated. It is a very good line. The sentiment is one I might have been proud to express. I simply lacked the occasion, and perhaps the grape.
Which brings us to the grape you almost had occasion for, Norton, Cynthiana, the vine growing 40 yards from where we're sitting. Tell me what you know about it.
What I know is incomplete, and that incompleteness has troubled me for a long time. In March of 1824, I was 80 years old, and the mountain was becoming harder to manage. A box of grape cuttings arrived at my agent's office in Richmond. Bernard Peyton wrote to tell me they had been sent by a Dr. Daniel Norborne Norton, a physician in the city, an amateur horticulturist of apparently serious commitment. The cuttings were addressed to my grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who was then overseeing Monticello. Peyton's note said simply, "By a wagon, a few days prior, I sent you a box of grape cuttings, sent to my counting house by Dr. Norton without directions. He tells me they were intended for Jefferson Randolph. Please acquaint him with it."
And then?
Nothing. As best I can determine, the cuttings were never planted.
I want to make sure our listeners understand the position Thomas Jefferson Randolph was in when that box arrived, because he is easy to judge from 2 centuries away, and that judgment is not fair. He was managing a heavily indebted, struggling estate. He had watched his grandfather plant and replant and pull up dead European roots for 50 years. He had seen the expense, he had seen the heartbreak. He had seen 7 experiments fail with the full force of Jefferson's intelligence and resources behind them. And then one day, an unlabeled box of twigs arrives from Richmond with a note that says, essentially, "Some doctor sent these, no instructions, good luck." He had every rational reason in the world to set that box aside. He had no way of knowing what was in it. None of us did yet.
No, he did not. And I have made my peace with that. What I have not entirely made peace with is the timing. 2 years. I died 2 years after that box arrived. 2 years in which I might have planted those cuttings myself, tended them through 1 season, perhaps 2, long enough to know. I would have known. I'm certain of it.
I believe you would have, because what Dr. Norton had sent was the answer to the question you had been asking for 50 years. The Virginia seedling, what became Norton, possessed exactly the genetic code you had been searching for. Native enough to survive the American climate, complex enough to make wine worth drinking, completely itself. Before Prohibition destroyed the industry, Norton wines were sent to Europe. They won a gold medal in Vienna in 1873, a silver in Paris in 1878. The grape you never got to plant was beating the best wines Europe had to offer, judged by European palates on European soil. The answer arrived in a wooden box at your agent's office in Richmond, 2 years before you died.
Everything I was trying to prove.
Everything. And it's still here. Norton survived Prohibition, survived neglect, survived every reason it had to disappear, because it is, like the argument you were making, too stubborn to quit. We grow it in North Georgia now, in the southern Appalachians, on land that was frontier territory in your lifetime. And it grows here the way scuppernong grows here, like it belongs, because it does. Mr. Jefferson, I have a glass of it right here. This is what the dream tastes like.
Then Dr. Norton succeeded where I could not.
He did, but he was standing on your shoulders. The question you spent 50 years asking is the reason he knew which answer to look for.
What does it taste like?
Dark, structured, a little wild, completely itself. It tastes like nowhere else on earth.
That is all I ever wanted. Pour me a glass, Mr. Zamaripa.
Mr. Jefferson, wine for you was never just wine. It was a political instrument, a public health argument, a statement about what kind of civilization America intended to be. You believed taxing wine was not a tax on luxury. You believed it was a tax on the health of the American people. Make that argument, because I think our listeners need to hear it from you directly.
The argument is simple, and I never understood why it required so much repetition. A man who cannot afford wine will not go without something to drink. He will drink what is cheap and available. In my era, that was whiskey, ardent spirits, a substance that destroyed families and corrupted public life with a thoroughness that no foreign enemy could have managed. No nation is drunken where wine is cheap. and none sober where the dearness of wine substitutes ardent spirits as the common beverage. Make wine affordable, and you change what people drink. Change what people drink, and you change how people live. A heavy tax on wine does not discourage drinking. It redirects it, downward, towards something cheaper and more destructive. I called it a tax on the health of our citizens because that is precisely what it was.
And yet the tax stayed, and Prohibition came, and in the American South, it arrived early and stayed long. But here is what I find remarkable, and what I want our listeners to hear clearly. The vine survived. The knowledge went underground, literally and figuratively, but the muscadine still grew wild along the Georgia coast. The Norton root survived in Missouri. The Catawba held on in the Carolinas. The Native American grape did what it has always done. It simply grew through everything. And now, right now in 2026, Southern wine is coming back. Not as a nostalgia project, not as a curiosity, as a serious, legitimate, world-class wine culture rooted in the grapes that were always meant to grow here. Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri. The South is a wine region again. The recovery, Mr. Jefferson, is well underway.
I planted for this. Not with any certainty that it would come, but with the belief that it should. I kept records of everything, every variety, every planting date, every failure. Not because I expected to succeed in my lifetime, but because I believed the record had value, that someone, someday, would need to know what had been tried, what had been learned, what was worth attempting again. 50 years of failed harvests is, in its own way, 50 years of data. Dr. Norton did not stumble onto the answer in a Richmond garden. He read my correspondence. He knew what I had tried. He knew what the Virginia soil had rejected. Every dead vine I documented was a boundary he did not have to rediscover. I was beta testing the American ecosystem so thoroughly that when the right grape appeared, the work of recognizing it was already half done.
That is the most generous possible interpretation of 50 years of failure. And I mean that as a compliment, because it's also true. And it speaks directly to every boutique vineyard, every small winery, every artisan grower who is right now wondering whether the work they're doing today will matter tomorrow. We are not just growing grapes, we are adding to the record. Every vintage we produce, every American varietal we plant, every wine we make that tastes like this specific mountain, that is data, that is knowledge. That is the next generation of growers inheriting something they didn't have to learn the hard way. The vine we plant today is the shade someone else sits under. That is not a reason to hesitate. That is the whole reason to plant.
The botanist and the winemaker are, at their best, the same person. Both are students of patience. Both are making an argument to the future on behalf of the present. What you are doing in these Georgia mountains, the native varietals, the artisan commitment, the refusal to imitate when you could instead discover, that is the argument made flesh.
We've talked about the turn toward native vines, the Norton cuttings that arrived 2 years too late, the political case Jefferson made for wine that Prohibition ignored, and that the vine outlasted anyway. In our final conversation, Episode 1, Part C, we bring Mr. Jefferson to Doghobble. He stands in a North Georgia vineyard for the first time. He tastes what the dream became. And we ask the question that every farmer and every listener carries out the door. What are the unplanted cuttings in your own life? I'm Sam Zamarripa. This is Uncorked.